One, two, three.
Welcome to Scéalta, and my name is Joe Austin. Can I remind you that Scéalta is a joint production of False Affairs to Hear and Film and Fumble. My guest today will be really known to most of us in one shape, form or other. But if, like me, you're kind of way good on voices but not so good on names, or you remember faces and you don't remember names, then we're going to put all those things together and we're going to introduce you to my guest, Jude Collins. So, Jude, welcome to Scéalta. It's great that you have made the time to come on and talk to us.
Sure, man. Good, Joe. Glad to be here.
And I said to you in the introduction there that your voice is better known than your face, and your writing is better known than your face as well. And that's fair enough, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I'm happy with that. Anything that hides my face, Joe, is good.
Oh, well, I have the same difficulty myself. But the kind of way to sort of, and we're going to delve in all of these aspects of your life, I hope, but I have to say you're 30 years a lecturer.
That's right.
True? You taught English in Derry, Belfast, and in Canada.
Yeah, 2 different places in Canada, yeah.
You're the author of 8 books.
Well, altogether 8 so far. We're working on the 9th.
So far. I have to say one of them not that flattering about the bishops, which is always something to be welcomed. And of course, you were or are a regular contributor to television and radio, and you also write your own blog columns. And
I have to correct you there, Joe. I was a regular contributor to radio and television. I no longer am.
Well, I want to come to that as well. So,
right.
I mean, you're extremely busy and you never stop. So for all of that, thank you for taking the time to do the interview.
No, it's always a pleasure, Joe.
If I can ask you, where did it all begin? Where did it all go wrong, perhaps?
Well, what are you referring to in my writing, is it? Or where did it come from? Or?
Start off, where are you from? What part of the world are you from?
I'm from Omagh originally, Joe. I was brought up on a farm about a mile outside Omagh, on the road to Knockmoyle, near to what we call Nestle's factory. Nestle's factory had it there, and my father used to. He had some dairy cattle, and he used to bring the milk and churns on the back of a cart with a horse down to the Nestle's, what we call Nestle's factory every day. So I grew up there, and there was 8 of us, and I was the last. I was a sort of an afterthought, and there was a gap of 3 years between me and the next one, and after that there was about 3 girls in a row. So I was suffering from the gap, and I was suffering from the fact that they were girls. So in a sense, although I was the last of 8, I was actually an only child in a sense, you know. And I remember growing up there, my father didn't really work me very hard, because while he had got cattle, he did all of the milking and so on. But he became more of a cattle dealer than a dairy cattle farmer. And really, my mother encouraged me. Well, she would get me to do work around the place, but a lot of the time I found myself on my own and a bit bored, in fact, very bored. So I'd mooch around the fields, and I would try to catch roach in the river. And I used to, the great gift I had, I think, was I had 2 older brothers, one who was 6 years older than me and the other who was 10 years older than me. Now, they were away from the house by the time I was beginning to grow up, but they were readers, and they left those paperback books. I don't know if you remember the first Penguins and Pelican books.
Oh, yeah.
And a lot of those were lying around the house. And I remember reading them, and some of the stories I'd read in them, I used to be so scared to go to bed. But I loved them just the same, because it took me out of myself, you know. I was no longer a wee boy stuck in the back of beyond, as I saw it, with nothing but trees and cows around me and grass. I was transported to, you know, wherever Edgar Wallace took me, or P.G. Wodehouse took me, or all these writers, and comics too, of course. So I think that's how I got my love of reading. It was something that gave me an escape route from being on my own.
It's often said of good writers, and of course you are a good writer.
Keep talking, Joe. Keep talking.
No, I mean, I admire people who have the courage to write and to put it out there and let other people judge whether it's credible, whether it's good, interesting, whatever. And I think it does take courage. I think that's probably why most writers are a wee bit mad. But leaving that aside just for a second, it's said of good writers that they're daydreamers, that they engage in the most sophisticated form of escapism. Was that the kind of child you were?
Yeah, well, I didn't know that I was very sophisticated in my escapism. I just took the route anytime that it came. I do reading. The other thing that I loved when I was a kid to escape to was the pictures. Now, we were a mile outside Omagh, but I used to go with my sisters when I was very small to pictures, but eventually they weren't interested in me. And I used to walk, as a primary school child, I used to walk in the dark road into Omagh at night, on an autumn night or even a winter's night. And I would go to the pictures maybe at 6 or 6:30, the first house as they called it. And then after it was over, I would walk the road out, and there was only street lamps for a quarter of the way. So the rest of the way was total darkness. And I remember we had a long lane, and I used to be particularly terrified walking up this lane at the end, because that was really pitch dark. And I remember I was halfway up it one day, and I heard this sound, sort of rustling of some kind beside a big tree. Oh God, I nearly died. And what it was a curtain couple.
I'm sure they nearly died as well.
Well, no, I think they were laughing. I think I heard the laugh as I went past, because I really, the heart was across me. But it was a very interesting thing, because I quickly forgot about that fear when the next movie came up, you know. Yeah. I so loved the pictures, musical comedies. I was in love with Debbie Reynolds for years.
And I'm sure she was an admirer of yours as well.
Yeah.
Tell me, school, where was school?
School was at Christian Brothers in Omagh, primary school. And it was, well, you know, you hear different stories about the Christian Brothers. You hear stories about how brutal they were, and you hear other stories about them. Now, I found some of the brothers, I can remember some of them were really quite rough, and lay teachers too, incidentally. You know, they didn't hold back from pulling out the strap and whacking you. So I did have one or two brothers that I wasn't, Christian brothers I wasn't too keen on. They were fairly rough-handed. On the other hand, they were very dedicated men. I remember when we were doing the 11 plus, the brother, he was, as I say, a bit of a tough nut, but he gave us classes on a Saturday morning where we would come in and we, you know, he'd give us extra tuition for nothing, really, you know. So yeah. I feel I owe a lot to them. I also have had the best, maybe one of the very best teachers ever I had was a Christian brother. And he used to teach us, he taught singing particularly, and he taught us English songs, and he taught us Scottish songs, and he taught us Irish songs. He taught us Aaron the Vein. He taught us Do You Ken John Peel. He taught us the recorder. He had a little recorder group which played 4-part harmony. Now, we were only about 9 at the time. I mean, he was brilliant. He never strapped, ever strapped. But I remember writing about him years later. I think it was in response to Malachi O'Doherty's piece. Malachi, of course, has got a serious detestation of all Christian brothers. And I wrote a piece saying, well, Malachi was half right. I always thought Malachi was just half right. That certainly there were very tough brothers, and some of them were quite brutal. But there were also some marvellous men. And I cited this case of this man. I think he was a Belfast man, actually, a brother Scéalta. So I said how wonderful he was. About 3 weeks later, I got this letter from England. And I would have written this, 20, 30 years ago. I got this letter from a woman, and she said, I was given a copy of your article, I think it was in Irish News, about the wonderful brother Scéalta. I hope you won't be shocked, but that wonderful man was my father. He had left the Christian Brothers, and she said he left with nothing but, I think, 10 shillings and what he stood up in, and went over to England and taught there and became eventually the head of the primary school somewhere in England and married one of the teachers, and that was this woman's mother and father. So I felt I felt I'd done a good deed, you know. I was glad that I'd spoken the truth, and I was glad that it got to her, and it clearly meant a lot to her, you know. He was dead at that stage, of course.
Secondary school and then university, I take it?
That's right. I was sent to St. Column's.
In Derry?
In Derry as a boarder. And I was there for 6 years. I'll be honest, Joe, I really didn't like it at all. Well, I shouldn't say at all. There were things about it were okay. But much of the time, certainly as a junior pupil, I was really homesick.
Yeah.
I used to go up there, we all slept in dormitories, and I remember going up, there was a toilet at the end of the dormitory. I remember going up and looking out up the river, up the Foyle, towards Strabane and on to Omagh, and thinking, God, wouldn't it be great if I could only get a boat or something? And all the time that I was there, I really didn't like it much. It was a kind of a violent place. You know, there was a kind of an institutionalized bullying. I mean, there were teachers like the Christian Brothers who used the strap ruthlessly, and some of them were really fanatic. The teacher who taught Irish, for example, I mean, he was renowned for his brutality. He was a terrible man. He was a priest. And there were others who weren't very good either. On the other hand, having said that, there were some of the teachers who were bloody marvellous. And I mean, I can think of two of them that I would attribute to the fact that I started enjoying writing. I would attribute it to them. There was a priest called Michael Hinney, and he used to give us essays to write. And then on the Saturday morning, he would give them back, having marked them, and he would get somebody to read out a piece of theirs. And he used to ask me to read out mine every so often. And I remember the thrill, absolute thrill of reading something. I always tried to be funny, make an idiot of myself. I'd read something out, and the boys in the class would laugh. Geez, I used to feel terrific. Your own peers were laughing at stuff that you had written on a page. It was magic. So that was very good. But being away from home, you know, I felt in a way, looking back, that I kind of lost my adolescent years. As I say, there was a sort of institutionalized bullying. It was a kind of a violent place, you know. We used to get so bloody bored that if a fight broke out, it was wonderful as long as you weren't on the receiving end. And it's true, you would hear boys say, "Fight, there's a fight, there's a fight." And, you know, everybody would run to the place where the fight was. And that was replicated in the prefect system as well. In the last year, the authorities would put in place 12 prefects who were last year boys, you know, boys of 17 or 18, and their job was to keep order. You know, if they caught any of the junior boys acting up or breaking the rules or anything, they would deal with them, and they dealt very harshly, you know. I mean, I remember getting my head slapped off practically by a very well-known person who was a prefect there at that time. And I refuse to name names.
Well, on air, maybe we can name them later on. But you're right about the whole boarding school, the whole concept of it. I remember I had an engagement with St. Malachy's College for a while. And like you, I came from a big family, quite close to St. Malachy's. So I left this, as a young boy, I left this very loving family. And you didn't always appreciate how much you were loved until you seen what love wasn't. And I would have went to St. Malachy's College, and I witnessed young boys been dragged out of bed and made to wash, and this very impersonal and bullying and rushing and kids crying and beds that had been wet by, these were only very, very small children. Jerry Anderson tells a great story about your school, and he talks about that they used to go around to the windows where the boarders were, and they would have got money to go to the shop to buy sweets for boarders or to buy perhaps cigarettes, and they kept the money, and then they would have went back the next week and they would have impersonated somebody else, and they kept that money as well. So
well, I would have to correct Jerry there, because that was something I did regularly. The trick was, there was a football field there, and we used to play soccer with you remember the sort of plastic balls that they had, smaller balls?
Yeah.
But we used to play football. And the trick was, if you wanted something from out town, if you wanted to get sweets in or something like that, you would kick the ball deliberately by accident over the wall. And then you'd climb up on the wall. So you're looking for the ball. And you would call to some young fellow, you get us that ball. So they always got the ball for us. And when they came, we would say, here, listen, would you get us, a bar of chocolate or whatever. And they knew that when they came back with it, we would pay them, 3D or something like that. But the thing that amazed me was there was never any question of them not coming back. Never any question of them keeping the money. Not in my experience.
Well, I think you met a better class of dairy ones than he did. I want to talk just a wee bit about your inspiration as a teacher and a lecturer. Before I do, just when you were saying there that hunger for looking up the foil for Strabane and out towards Omagh or where you can see in that direction. Walter Mackin, as you know, said about taking the man from the bog, that you can take the bog from the man, but not the man from the bog. Was there an element of that in boarding school? Did you miss what you knew and what you were familiar with?
Not really. As I say, my childhood wasn't unhappy in the sense that I had parents, although they were strict parents. All parents were fairly strict then. But I mean, my family were good people, and certainly my parents were good people. But I was bored stiff. I was bored out of my mind, and that's why I started to read. So while I kind of longed for home, it wasn't so that my mother would talk to me or my father or my brothers or sisters. What I missed was being able to sit at the fire with a book, or being able to listen to the wireless, or being able to go to the pictures, or being able to get something to eat when you wanted it, It was that. Two things I remember from St. Columns in terms of the general life. It was very cold. During winter, the heating was central heating. But if you were in the big study hall, if you were far away from the pipes, you could be bloody freezing. But if you were beside them, you were flying. And the dean, if he ever caught you sitting on a radiator in your free time, he would bloody well murder you. I suppose he was trying to stop us getting chilblains on our arse. But, at the same time, I have that sense of cold and also that sense of hunger. We were hungry all the time. You'll remember, Joe, when you're an adolescent, you're never not hungry.
Yeah,
You can eat a farmer's ass through a hedge, as they say. That was something that, that was a privation you had to put up with. And I think it made us a bit edgy. I was thinking back on it and talking to somebody about it the other day, and I was saying, that was probably part of the reason for some of the violence, was we were cold, we were miserable. So if somebody said something, instead of, accepting it, you might say, you tried to say that to me, have a whack. So the cold and the hunger, those are two of the things that stay with me. And that prevailing sense of a certain violence. It was run more or less like a military camp, I imagine. I never was a soldier, but I guess that's how they ran them.
University, what year did you go to? You went to university in Belfast, I take it, did you?
No. I went to Maynooth for 2 years
right.
Until they decided and I decided that I didn't have the right qualities for a priest. And then I went to UCD
Right.
and I loved UCD. I really loved Dublin. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the fact that after being in boarding school for so many years and class with boys and the Maynooth was same, suddenly there were women around, young women. That was very exciting. And Dublin, I was talking to a guy, a dairyman. He actually was the Irish ambassador for a variety of places, including Switzerland and so on. Sharkey. I think he may be a cousin of, what do you call him? Fergal Sharkey.
Yeah.
But I was talking to him about it, and well, it's hard to say really. We both look back on it, and I suppose he was distinguished. He was a sort of a star in a way at St. Columns, and when he went to Dublin, he said he couldn't believe how free he felt. And he said that when him and another guy from Derry came back the first Christmas to Derry. They got off the train very late at night, about 11 o'clock, and they looked around and everything was dark. And they said, oh, geez, I think we should get in the train and go back to Dublin. He said it was so good on Sundays, the parks weren't locked up.
Yeah.
On Sundays, the pubs weren't locked up. You know, there was a freedom and a bigness and, you know, a reaction to Dublin that was totally positive. And I felt something of that. I really did. I fell in love with it.
Let me just explain that term you used there, because we would have a fair amount of people who would watch Scéalta, will watch this program, that really won't be familiar with the term parks locked up. And this was a decision taken by the Unionist administration, this God-fearing grouping of people who decided that it was something sinful of a child having a swing or going down a slide on a Sunday. And they fought these changes tooth and nail. So, I mean, it's more symbolic than it is, well, no, it's more actual than it is symbolic. Maybe that's a description. It's the actual nature of the running of the state. What year were you in university? What years were you in university?
Well, I got my degree in '64, and I remember it as well. I did quite well in it, and I remember I was back in Derry because I kept in touch with a lot of Derry boys, and there was quite a few Derry boys in UCD then, quite a collection of them. There was none there the first year or so that I was there, but then in the year I did my degree, quite a few came up and or down to Dublin, and it was. I just felt very good. I went back to my old teacher in Derry, and I said to him, I told him how well I'd done, and he as if he had got it, you know. He stood up and shook hands with me. You know, I felt I was boasting, but at the same time I was glad I told him, you know, because he sort of, in a way, felt that it was him that had done that, and he was right too. You know, it was as much him that made for anything that I achieved as I had. So that was lovely, and I loved Dublin. I stayed and I did a master's the following year. And Joe, it'll be interesting to you, I'm sure. I was well funded by the Tyrone Education Board, I guess it was called, for the years I was in UCD. We got something like £300 a year, and my God, that was a lot of money then.
Yeah.
I didn't. Where I stayed, I only paid something like 30 shillings a week for my bed sitter, but you still had enough money to have a good old time. When I finished my degree, I got a good mark, as I say, and then they said they would accept me as a master's student for another year. And I said, oh, great, because I knew the boys that I'd been at school with in Omagh who'd gone to Queen's, they were going on to do a master's program in Queen's. And I knew that they had got a scholarship, continuing scholarship money funded by the Education Board. I got an awful gunk when I put in for it. I was refused it. And I said, what the hell? And I appealed it. And I remember well going into a room. It must have been in Omagh. I went. There was 4 men in it, 4 what seemed to me older men and 1 younger man. And they asked me what was I planning to do, and I said I really wanted to do this master's program, and I was delighted that I'd managed to get into it, and I was hoping that I'd be funded for it. And I remember one guy said to me, the young guy said, well, and where do you want to do this studying? Well, I says, well, I'm at UCD and I'd like to go on for another year there. And he said, would you not study in your own country? And they didn't give me it. They rejected my appeal as well. And funny now, the one person on the council who stood up for me and fought for me, and unsuccessfully this happened, was a Protestant minister from down the road from us. So it's a mixed tale, isn't it? You know, these were stout unionists. I have no doubt the Presbyterian clergyman voted for a unionist candidate as well, but he was a decent man. And I remember him saying, you know, this is outrageous. And yet it still didn't matter. He could say it was outrageous, but it still stuck.
It's all about, it was all very much about control and about how you kept these people, meaning me and you, and people of that generation, very much in their place, which is going to feature as we go along with this interview. Can I just ask you, in terms of the family, were you the first of the family, or was there other people who had proven to be academically very bright?
Yes. Well, let me. My two brothers. Now, my second brother, the brother who was 6 years older than me, he was very bright. He became a priest. Well, he's still alive. He became a priest, and he was extremely bright. He in his junior, if you remember the junior certificate, he flew through it. I remember my sister saying, "Geez, hey, look at the marks he got. You know, he got all these." Whatever it was, top mark, I've forgotten now. Distinctions, that's right, distinction. And then he went on, and he in his final year in the senior certificate, he got an exhibition, which meant that all your marks were over 80. And he was the very first year. I think John Hume was a classmate of his, or the same year as him. They were the first Catholic cohort, as it were, to come through that 11 plus. Now, I have mixed feelings, and I know in the end I know which side I come down on. The 11 plus did great things for people. They allowed people like John Hume to emerge. They opened up professions for people they otherwise never would have had. So it was great that way. But in another way, it was bloody awful. I'm putting together a book at the moment about people remembering their schooling, interviews again. And one of the guys is talking about in primary school in Derry. He said he was at the school and the teachers just went around and said, "You'll do the 11 plus, you'll do it, you do it. You boys be quiet." And for the next 6 months, he'd work with the select group. And he was one of the select group, and he got the same columns as a result. So it was great for him, but it was too bloody bad for the other people. If they weren't, cutting the mustard at that stage. I've been in education all my life. And I don't for a moment believe that you can decide at 11 that this kid will prosper and that kid will not. In fact, I don't believe that you can do that at any stage. I think people develop at different stages. I did a lot of radio work, as you know, with the BBC here. Yeah. And one of the programs I did, I actually got a Sony Award for it, was called Varying Degrees. And it was about people who in their adult years went back to university, back to college, not back, but went there for the first time.
Yeah.
And I remember interviewing guys, and there was everybody from a woman who was in her early 30s, who was a hairdresser, who went back and did a degree. And the oldest was an orange man in the 70s who had gone back when he was in his 70s and done a degree. But all of them were full of praise for what it did for them going back. They said, and it wasn't that it got them great jobs or anything. It may have later on, but they said, I realized suddenly I wasn't stupid, And I was saying to them, well, you're the same person that you were told was stupid way back then. What happened? And they said, well, I didn't feel so afraid anymore.
Yeah.
And I found that with my own kids, I was rotten at a lot of subjects at school. I was terribly bad at things like Latin and maths and science. I failed more exams, Joe, than you could shake a stick at. I was good at English and I was good at history and I wasn't bad at French, but most of the rest I was rotten at. But when my kids were going to school, I was able to do the homework with them. And by God, I was able to handle the Latin and I was able to handle the maths and so on. So what had changed? I was confident now. I wasn't having somebody going to knock my bloody head off if I didn't get it right,
I want to ask you taught for quite a while, taught English.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that's the kind of the poacher becoming the gamekeeper. And you talk about your own childhood. I've spoken to a number of people who graduated and then became school teachers, and they said that one of the most frightening, Linda Irvine actually, who had spoken to, who, as you know, became a teacher, said that one of the most frightening days of her life was looking down at a class of wee children and going, what am I going to say? So how was First of all, how was your first experience as a teacher, and how was your experience as a teacher? So tell me about your first day being the grown-up teacher.
Right. I can't remember it. I can't remember it. I taught for my first teaching was in, well, actually, yeah, well, after I finished, I finished my master's, and then I did a HDIP at UCD, which was the equivalent of a PGCE here. After, I graduated, you had a year of teacher training, so to speak. So in that year, actually, I was lecturing in a college for teachers. But my first year in a real class was a secondary school in Dublin. It was a very rare thing in Dublin. It was a non-denominational school, and it had boys and girls together, which was very surprising. And it was run by a couple from Donegal, actually. I don't remember being afraid. I don't remember being afraid at all. I remember I actually enjoyed it, and I think very fondly of it. I actually, inside the last year, I've got in touch with the guy who said, I remember you because you used to give us extra class because to get us so we could do the honours. And I remember I did that, all right. And he says, I've always been grateful to you because it meant I could go on and have a career. I liked it. I enjoyed it. One of the people I taught was Charlie Bird. You know Charlie Bird from RTE?
Yeah.
I'll tell you a good story about Charlie Bird. Here's a good one for you now. You know the way teachers, I bet you could tell me every single teacher you had at primary school. You could name them. And the same in secondary school. Well, now, remember when the Queen came to Dublin?
Yes.
Everybody and his mother was down there. Well, I was doing a thing with a guy on Radio 5 at the time, and he asked me to go down. Oh, no, it was Nolan. That's who it was. Nolan, first of all. Nolan wanted me to go down and do a piece because he knew I would give a contrary line. So I went down to Dublin. I had to go to the press centre, and I had never been to the press centre at all to get a pass. But anyway, I went and I got it. And I was coming out. Who's coming in the door but Charlie Bird? And I hadn't seen Charlie Bird since he was, 17, 16. And I said to Charlie, oh, how are you, Charlie? And I shook hands with him. And he says, oh, how are you? And I could tell by the way he said it that he didn't recognize me. And so I says, Charlie, I said, I used to teach you. He says, did you? I said, yeah, I taught you English in Sandymount High School. Yes, he says, I went to Sandymount High School. And I said, yeah, and I taught you English for a year. Yeah, what was your name? I said, it was Collins. Collins? I don't remember anybody called Collins. He meant it, whether he was for real or not, I don't know. But it was the ultimate put down, Here was me thinking that I was a wonderful, unforgettable character. But I'd also say this is a sort of a nasty thing to say, but Charlie himself admits it, because he's in this next book of interviews. He was a very, very poor student. He was one of the weakest students in English I've ever taught in my life. So,
well, if it's any consolation, I spent half of my life getting mistaken for Danny Morrison. People come along and
have you sued, have you?
Hi, I should be. Hi, Danny. And I'm also told that he gets mistaken for my younger brother. So I don't know whether that's true or what that's in. So you taught for quite a time. Tell me, you talked about the liberating feeling of Dublin. So what was Canada like? You went to Canada, you taught in Winnipeg, I believe?
I taught in Edmonton, and I taught for 2 years in Edmonton and for about 5-6 years in Winnipeg.
Yeah.
The first year of teaching was tough enough, because the kids there were there was no uniform or any nonsense like that. They were very socially assured, They weren't cowed by a teacher. There was no corporal punishment, of course. And that's something I pride myself on, mind you, Joe. Despite the fact that some of the schools I taught in, like I taught in the Cregan and Derry at one stage, where everybody slapped. And I never slapped a kid. So that's one proud boast that I have. Although many of the schools, all of the schools in Canada that I taught in didn't allow slapping anyway, so even I wanted to. Yeah. But the first year was difficult because, some of them anyway, because some of the kids would be really, really little. I'm trying to think of a polite word for them. But by and large, the kids there were very nice. They really were very interested in you and where were you from? Were you from London or England or where? And they'd say, "Oh, I'm Irish too." And I went with a guy originally from Dublin that I'd been at UCD with, and it really was a whole new world, you know. The schools were all so new, the buildings were so new. The fact that you didn't have corporal punishment was a new thing. You could talk to kids and kids would come up and talk to you about whatever you're working on. You had a kind of a sort of a relationship with them. And it was very eye-opening for us, and for me anyway. And overall, certainly my time of teaching in Canada, I had a whale of a time. In fact, there's a dictionary here, which I got that as a going away present from my last class in Canada, or one of the last classes I had. And it was a bunch of boys and girls who were they weren't the top tier by any means, but they bought me that when I was leaving. And they've written little dedications inside, you know, hope all the best for the future and so on. And in many cases, they make spelling mistakes and grammatical mistakes.
Well,
but it warms my heart, Joe. I can tell you now, they could have given me £1,000 and it wouldn't even begin to compare with something like that. I'll tell you another quick incident of a present I got from kids. I taught in the Cregan and Derry I taught for 2 years in Canada. I came back, I got married, and then I taught in the Cregan for just 3 months from the summer until Christmas. And then I went back to Canada with my wife. When I was leaving the Cregan after 3 months, the last day, I think it was, I was in the staff room and there was a knock on the door, staff room. Somebody went and he says, "There's some kids out there work for you." So I went out and there's these 3 kids standing there and they said, sir, we have a present for you. You're leaving, like, I'm going to give you a present, like, you know. So I said, "Oh, jeez, boys, you don't give me a present. You're very good." And he said, "Here, sir." And I held out my hand and he put 1 shilling and 10 pence in my hand. And I looked at it and I said, "Jeez, boys, I can't be taking your money." And sure, we collected for it. We got it to class, we put it together, class, that's a class present. So that's a present to you. And I said, "Thank you very much, boys." You know, it was beautiful. Really was. Oh, I'm still moved by it when I think about it, you know.
But that relationship that a good teacher has with pupils, either in the formal sense or just in to be able to influence and to see the fruits of that, must be very rewarding. You went on then to lecture for 30 years, almost 30 years?
29 years, actually.
29 years. And I want to cover a large chunk of your broadcasting experience, but while lecturing, were you still writing? Were you still looking to write? Had you kind of toyed with the idea?
I never stopped writing, Joe. I always was doing a writing of some kind. I suppose the original form, when I was at UCD, there was a program in RTE called Dear Sir or Madam. And what it was letters from listeners given out about something or drawing attention to something. So I wrote to them. They used to give the 3 prizes each week for the winning the best letters. The third best got 1 guinea. The second best got 2 guineas. And the top was 3 guineas.
Wow.
I wrote into them, and you know, I found I made up stuff. And I found I began to win the bloody thing. I was getting 3 guineas. I couldn't believe it, you know. And it got to the stage very quickly. I won it about 2 or 3 times. And then it got to a stage where I said, there's no way I can keep on writing. These guys, they will not, you know, even they think I should get it, they won't give it to me because it looks like ridiculous. So what I used to do was I was very friendly with Dairy Boy, so I used to say, "Listen, I want to use your name and your address, right? And if I win anything, you'll get it. The check will come to you. But it's really for me because I'll have written it. And I'll give you 10%. I'll give you, whatever it was. 2 and 6pence or something like that, half a crown. So that's what I did. I went round all the dairy boys, and I had about 6 different guys that I wrote under their name. But that was kind of magic, you know, to hear the guy reading out your letter as well, and also to have money for it, you know. That was great. So I kept on writing all the time, Joe. I sort of I forced myself to write. I forced myself to sit down and spend an hour, even when I didn't feel like it, writing. And I wrote some off of Thripe, you know. But you know, it gave me a satisfaction. My conscience felt clear, you know. It's probably the Presbyterian in me coming out, you know.
I said earlier on that many people they'll know your name or they'll know your voice, and now they have an opportunity to see the full thing. How did you fall into broadcasting? How did you end up being a broadcaster and a writer of columns?
Well, the broadcasting started while I was still in Canada. In the last 6 months before we, more or less, the last 6 months before we came back in 79. The CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, had a local radio station, Radio Winnipeg, and they had a little competition. I forget what it was. Oh yeah, that's what it was. They said, there's a lot of soap operas in the States. Now, we want listeners to send in for this competition, and it is to give us what would be the ideal Canadian soap opera, because Canadians are very keen on distinguishing themselves from the...
Yeah.
So I wrote this little spoof thing, you know, and I sent it in, and I won the bloody thing. But the only thing was, that, you know what the prize was? You got to go on to the program. You know, not a big deal. But actually, I thought it was a big deal at the time. But through that, I spoke to after I'd done, all I did was just sit there, and they said, oh, do you do much writing? And I said, yeah, sometimes write. Haven't published much, but and so on. But after I'd done that little broadcast, I came out, and the producer of the program came out and walked down the corridor with me to take me out. And he said, do you do any other writing? And I said, well, I said there, I write all the time, but nobody seems to be able to. And he said, well, you know, why don't you, write me something? And I wrote him in some stuff. And in no time at all, there was a little section of about 2 minutes that used to be on the morning radio show in Radio Winnipeg, where people came on, and it was like a thought for the day, only you could write about any bloody thing or talk about anything you wanted to. It wasn't religious at all. So I started doing those, and God, they were tumbling out. I was getting them accepted right, left, and centre, and they were putting a break on me. They said, you can only appear once a week, you know. But it was magic. It really was magic. I hear suddenly, all those years of sitting scribbling and really getting not too far, it was working. And to hear, big broadcasts, and people were saying, geez, I heard you were talking on the radio. And I would say, yeah, but sure, I was talking to you yesterday. And they said, yeah, but you were on the radio. There was something magic about that. So that's where it started, and I continued it.
My mother, who's passed, who's dead, was a mill worker, and she instilled in all of her children this need to read, to be able to read. I don't mean to be able to read words, I mean to be able to read a book, to have a sense of the book. And she talked about, when you read a book, you're on a magic carpet, and a book will transport you anywhere. That sense of both escapism and education and freedom and all of that. When I'm looking at your eyes, when you're talking about the enjoyment of reading, the enjoyment of relating something that you had wrote to be interviewed, your eyes are dancing. I don't know why you're aware of that, but your eyes are dancing. So if you
it's a drugs joke.
It probably is. Get us some if you can. But it's probably that, I want to ask you about that combination of the enjoyment of writing and the crusading nature, or the crusading side to your nature. So were you're starting to broadcast, you're back home, you're broadcasting, you mentioned the illustrious Stephen Nolan earlier on in your comments. You're starting to appear on Talkback, you're doing all of that. Was it at all, perhaps, maybe it wasn't, was it a restraining factor? Did you see yourself in there to fight and to contradict some of the more preposterous stuff that was being put out by the establishment media. Was it a battle for you, or was it, how did you approach it?
Joe, when I came back from Canada, and I always quote this as an example of how your surroundings very often shape your thinking. When I came back from Canada in '79, I say to people, I could have signed up for the Alliance Party with no problem. Because in Canada, they saw it as a war of warring religious tribes, and I would correct them on that. But at the same time, I sort of bought into that. You know, it was this mindless violence that was going on, and how horrible was it? And you just sort of, soon as these people would learn to, you know, stop being mad and killing each other. That was the view I had. So for many years, going into the BBC, that's why I got in. I'm convinced that's why I was allowed. I was a Catholic, and yet I had no political axe to grind, apparently, or I wasn't preaching any nationalist or Republican line. So for quite a long time, certainly up until I would say the late 80s, I wasn't doing anything. None of the programs I was involved with, none of the talks that I gave or book reviews or films or anything, had anything to do with politics. It was only my own, I've talked to Danny Morrison about this, but my own sort of thinking was very slow. Well, for a start, I would have been frightened to say my own thinking, because I was surrounded, I still am, surrounded by people who would have a very strongly contrary view.
Yeah.
So you learn not to speak it. In addition to that, of course, I'm middle class. And the middle classes, in my opinion, in the North, sat out the troubles, you know, for the most part. Their houses weren't being raided. They weren't having people arrested, or their brother, or they weren't having people shot dead. So by and large, the middle classes, including me, sat that out, weren't affected by it. But I think it was, I've written about it in Danny Morrison's book about the hunger strike. How very gradually, when that happened, I started to get into arguments with my family, not my own family, but my siblings, because we used to congregate every year on the date of my father's death, and we would have a meal and we would talk and so on. There was a lot of it. Good. And occasionally the troubles would come up. And when the hunger strike came up, we were talking a lot about it. And most of my siblings were very critical. They were saying things like they're dying for nothing, or they're dying for each other, or they're afraid not to die, or things like this. And I just couldn't see things like that, you know? It didn't seem to me to make sense to be talking like that. And I think it was that convinced me, you know, that you can't simply ignore the facts of something. So my column in Irish News, which I'd been doing for years, which was talking about little funny things that happened to me and how my washing machine broke down and so on, it began gradually to become a TV program. I was doing a TV review program, and I began to start to review political figures that were appearing in the TV. And I began to get more and more critical of them. And eventually I was outright nationalist or Republican even in my views. So I would attribute it to the hunger strike eventually forcing me to look at the thing and see, you know, people don't die for something that's sort of mad, or they don't die for something that's stupid. You know, you only die for something you really care an awful lot about.
I think that took a lot of courage, I have to just say, because it is easier in life. Well, it mightn't be as honest, but it's easier in life just to keep your head down and kick the television set when you go home, or fight with the cat or whatever. But were you mindful of the fact that you were moving outside of what was acceptable, what was politically acceptable? Were you mindful of that? Was this a kind of I don't care anymore attitude, or was it a gradual?
Well, I remember I'd done a column one week in Irish News, and I don't know where the circumstances were. Maybe it was the first time I met Martin McGuinness, and he said, maybe it was, I used to have a newspaper review in the BBC as well. And I think Martin McGuinness might have said something like, I really like, I liked what you said there. And I think I said something positive about the Sinn Féin.
Yeah.
And I said, I said something like, yeah, you have to call it like you see it. But this idea of being courageous, I just think that's terribly excessive. Martin McGuinness launched one of my books, the book about St. Columns, actually. And he talked about me and he said, oh, he's absolutely fearless. How ridiculous. How ridiculous. I wasn't fearless. I was a little middle-class man writing in a newspaper. It was people like Martin McGuinness and others that were really fearless. So, while it made for uncomfortable meetings with people, people didn't bring it up to me. The only people who bring it up to me would be my family, my siblings, as I say, or occasionally cousins, But whatever you say nothing was the kind of rule that prevailed with other people. I was aware of the fact that people who saw me every day were probably looking at me a bit, but I never felt that I was being courageous in doing it. Not at all.
Well, we're not going to argue over the program because that would be bad manners, but I do think that it takes courage for people in any walk of life, for anything that they believe in, to step outside of what they are told are the acceptable boundaries and to say, no, I don't agree with that. So me and you will agree to disagree. So I want to talk, 5 minutes left. So 8 books, one on the way. So let's start in reverse. If you wish to talk about the one, sometimes writers want to keep this new child a wee bit of a secret. So what is the new book, and does it have a theme?
It has. It's like the previous 4. I did 8 books so far.
Yeah.
4 of them are fiction, 2 novels and 2 collections of short stories, and 4 of them are books of interviews where I take a theme and I interview people about it. The first one was about boys who had left St. Columns or went to St. Columns in the 1950s. And the most recent one was about Brexit and the border. The one that I'm working on at the moment with Pat McArt, who used to be the editor of the Dairy Journal during the 1980s. He and I are putting together a book about asking people about their education. Now, that's the broad thing. We're thinking of going to call it My Education, but Pat suggested maybe it'd be better if I said, what shaped me? Because very often it's other forces than your actual formal education. Although not an awful lot of people remember their formal education days, positively or negatively. So that's what we're doing. To be honest with you, the books of interviews are a pleasure and easy. Because, as you know, you see, somebody else is doing all the talking and doing all the work in a way. Whereas the 2 books of short stories and the 2 novels, those you have to spin out of your guts, you have to draw on your own experience and you have to write every single word of it. Whereas if you're transcribing an interview, you're just taking somebody else's words. So it's easy peasy, really, compared to writing fiction, I think.
Do you have a favorite book?
Yes.
What is your favorite book?
Yes, my favorite book's my first one, Booing the Bishop, because it was the first one. It's like children. One of the programs I did in the first documentary I did in the BBC was the first time. So I got people to talk about different first times. Now, everybody's mind immediately goes straight to a particular first time. And most of them are thinking in sexual terms. That wasn't what I was looking at. Much milder than that. For example, one of the people I interviewed was, what's her name from Derry? Nell McCafferty.
Yeah.
And she told me about her first kiss, which she got her first kiss from a boy in the Gaeltacht and she gave him a cigarette for it.
Well, I mean, well. What I've steered away from deliberately, because I was trying and capture you, a full resume of you. You're a family man, you're a father, you're a partner, you're all of that there. Do you see yourself in your children? Do you see yourself coming through? And do you see the children of changing you, which is the case quite often?
Well, sometimes people used to say to me, how do you find the time to do all the stuff you do, like broadcasting and writing and so on? And I said, there's a very simple answer to that. I neglect my family. And I'd say there's, like I said it ironically and humorously, but I think there's an element of truth to it. You know, when I see my own kids and I see how involved they are with their children, you know, I feel shamed, you know, because I think I was a good father, not a bad father anyway, but I didn't begin to engage with the kids the way they do. But perhaps that's a different generation, you know.
Yeah, I think so.
I do see myself coming out in them. My daughter, for example, has the same kind of obsessive kind of work ethic, you know. For better or worse, I'm never happy except I'm doing some kind of work, and that means writing or something of that nature, or interviewing, something of that kind. So I see that coming out in my daughter. She's got that same compulsive quality. She was very, very bright, and she went to Oxford and she went to Cambridge later on. I'm just mentioning that because she has that relentless drive. I think you pay a bit for that, you know. As I say, you miss out on other things if you have it. But I see that coming out in her. I also see myself in the features of some of my sons. I have 3 sons, and at least one of them I can see myself as a young man, or now a middle-aged man, except that he's about twice as good looking as I was. Damn him.
If it's any consolation, W.C. Fields, who I suspect we both like, W.C. Fields, when he ran for President of America, which is another topic altogether, given the current political situation in that country. But W.C. Fields, as his election slogan said, that anyone who doesn't like dogs and can't stand children can't be all bad, so they're worth the vote.
Yeah.
I suppose looking back over all of that, we're just on the last seconds of our interview, which is, the time has, I have to say, went by rapidly.
Zoomed past, Joe.
Looking back, are you former teacher, former lecturer, current writer, broadcaster, podcaster, grandfather, father, brother? Are you that, or are you all of the above? How would you, if you could do it in a one line, how would you describe Jude Collins?
Well, I'd say this half facetiously, and I tend to, but there is a truth in it too. I'm going to quote somebody, I've forgotten who said it originally, but they said they wanted the inscription put on their tombstone. I hope they say of me when I am dead, his sins were scarlet, but his books were red.
Like, you've stolen the show again. So on that quotation, let's not try and improve in perfection. So for being my guest, thank you. I've enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it.
I have. I love talking about myself, Joe.
And let's hope we sell this new book as we've sold the rest. So, Garamil Melka, thank you.
Once you're on.
Amor.
Amor.